Hello and welcome to this ISM Trust webinar on psychological and personal barriers to singing. This webinar is part of the ISM Trust's Breaking the Singing Barrier resource, a series of webinars and videos to help music teachers understand, explore and overcome the barriers to singing that exist for children, young people and adults of all cultures and backgrounds. The resource aims to help you create a safe space for singing. I'm Ruth McPherson, Head of Charity Development at the ISM. And to describe myself today, I'm a white woman with long brown hair and I'm wearing a pink jumper and the ISM Trust logo is behind me. And I'm delighted to be joined on this webinar by Dr. Ally Daubney, Honorary Senior Lecturer in Education at the University of Sussex and freelance music education researcher, author and workshop leader. Michael Spence, Kadai Specialist at Guildhall School of Music and Drama, Educational Consultant for the Royal Opera House and Vocal Coach. And Baz Chapman, Joint Head of Sing Up Foundation, Manager of the Singing for Health Network and Co-founder and General Manager of the National Teachers Choir. And before we begin the webinar, just a few things to note. Please do introduce yourselves to your fellow attendees in the chat box. We'd like to know your role in music and where you're joining us from. And if there are any particular singing barriers that you're interested in finding out more about. We'll also be dropping some useful links in the chat as we go. And please feel free to ask our panelists questions using the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer these in the Q&A section at the end. If you experience any technical difficulties, let us know in the chat and we'll attempt to resolve them. And if you wish to use them, subtitles are available to enable at the bottom of your screen. The webinar is being recorded and we will share the recording with you afterwards, as well as a feedback survey, which we'd be very grateful if you could fill out. The ISM Trust is the ISM's sister charity, which offers high-quality professional development to everyone working in the music sector. Through the ISM Trust, the ISM gives back to the sector and supports and empowers music professionals to succeed. The Trust produces award-winning events, training and resources which are largely completely free to access. Please do consider supporting the work of the ISM Trust by becoming a friend, making a donation, or even leaving a legacy. Any support that you can offer is really appreciated. So I'm very pleased to hand over now to our panelists, who I will invite to introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Ally. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. And also thank you for inviting me to join you today. As Ruth said, I'm Dr. Ally Daubney. I've been in and around music, teaching music really since the 1990s. In school, as an instrumental teacher and in initial teacher education. Now, my interest in today's topic really has kind of grown and grown over a very long period of time. My degree is originally in music and psychology, so I suppose somehow it's always been there. But I'm married to a chartered psychologist, and he works a lot in the domain of sport. So a lot of the work that we have done together on performance anxiety has been drawn from across music and sport. Just to introduce myself to you in another way, I'm a white female with long fair hair. I'm wearing a kind of flowery top, and I've got a bookshelf full of mostly travel books, actually, sitting right behind me. So I'm going to hand over to our next presenter to join us on the panel today, which is Baz Chapman.
Thanks, Ally. Hello, everyone. I'm Baz. I suppose I've always been, I suppose, a bit of a doer in the world of music and education, and particularly around singing, in the sense that I love just making things happen. Particularly, we know that the benefits of singing are so widespread, making sure that those benefits can reach everyone, really, I guess I'd describe as my life's work. I'm also an arranger and occasional choral accompanist and stuff like that. I am wearing a blue and orange short sleeve t-shirt. I am tall and bald and fair skinned. I'm wearing glasses. Behind me is a piano keyboard and a picture of an eagle diving into a Scottish loch. And I'm ringing in from the north of Scotland. So I'm going to hand across to Michael Spence now.
Hello, everybody. I'm Michael Spence. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Baz. My background is very varied in music education. I started off as a secondary music specialist for several years. I've always worked with choirs and been an avid singer. And then a few years ago, I decided to leave school teaching and to work as a freelance music educator. I specialize in Kodály musicianship. I do a lot of work with the Royal Opera House, designing curriculums for them. And I oversee the musicianship programs in the junior department at Junior Guildhall as well. All through singing, which is fantastic. Why the Kodály method really resonates with me. Having done lots of work with choirs, it was a real interest for me during my master's to look into how gender discrepancies or stereotypes can negatively impact singers in the classroom, and how understanding students of all ages, understanding their sexualities and their backgrounds, just the worlds that they live in, how we can best support them in our classrooms. So that's where I'm coming from today in this webinar.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much for those introductions. And it's wonderful to have such an esteemed panel with us on this webinar. So we're going to dive straight in because this is obviously a very broad topic and we have lots of things that we want to cover. So before we kind of get into the detail, I'd like to ask you all what you think the top 3 personal and psychological barriers to singing are. Just as an overview, if you could kind of give us your top 3, that would be fantastic. So we'll maybe go in the same order and start with you, Ally, please.
Get the easiest job then, got the whole pick of everything. And there are many to choose from. I really deliberated over this, but I went for fear of failure, which can encompass all sorts of things, but sometimes that comes out as fear of experiencing shame and embarrassment. You see that quite a lot in young people. My second one I would pick out is self-image and self-belief. Again, a great big thing. The I'm not a good singer, or it doesn't quite align what I'm being asked to sing with the way that I can sing. All of these things around image, I think there's a lot in there, and belief. And the third one would be psychological safety and the lack of opportunity to sing in an open and free way, or a perceived open and free way. So sometimes it's about perception, not actuality.
Brilliant, thank you. And what are your thoughts, Baz?
They sort of dovetail with Ali's, I think. Firstly, sensitivity around one's own voice, which can lead to a fear of being exposed or judged. Secondly, a whole host of non-musical things that might be neurodivergence or gender nonconformity or ethnicity, or really anything that can make a person feel like that singing activity isn't for the likes of them. And thirdly, a lack of singing normalization in a young person's life, so that the act of singing somehow feels like an unusual thing to do rather than something that is deep within all of us.
Okay, thank you. And Michael?
For me, I've thought about this as there's so many different barriers, but for me, I think not having control over your voice, if you're an inexperienced singer, for teenagers, if they're going through vocal change, boys' voices don't break, that's not how that works. It sounds incredibly painful. Girls' voices change as well. So that period of loss of control, I think, can be a barrier. So having a skilled teacher who can help a student navigate that is important. Lack of confidence in your identity as a singer, which I think ties into my previous point, but similar to what Baz was saying, sort of how society understands singing, whether it's cool to sing or which groups you're singing with, understanding who you are as a singer and where you fit. And then kind of tied into that, more from a teacher or choir director's end of the podium, the repertoire selection and the audition process. So the way that we are welcoming singers into our groups, into our classes, into our choirs, and then what we're providing for them and how we're facilitating that.
Brilliant, thank you all. There's lots of barriers mentioned there, so lots of things to consider. And how do you think we can support students to overcome some of these barriers? What would be your top tips? Maybe if we go in backwards order this time, seeing as we just heard from Michael. Michael, do you want to give us some top tips on some of those things, those barriers you were talking about?
Sure. So For repertoire selection, I think actively, taking an active stance in your repertoire selection, putting some thought into it, not just picking latest pop tunes or stuff you've done before historically, but really kind of scrutinizing what is the message of the music. What about the diversity of the composers? Have I got any female composers within my my selection for this term? Are the songs particularly gendered, especially if we're looking at love songs, and the use of pronouns going on there? In terms of the lack of confidence, I think that comes over time, and I think it certainly took a long time for me to become confident in who I am as a singer. And I think if, as teachers, we can emulate that we are confident to stand at the front of the class and to sing, we can then radiate that to our students and provide them with opportunities and safe spaces to play and figure out how their voice works, make mistakes and learn from them. And then in terms of the having control over their voices, again, it comes with time. I would really advocate for music educators to go on specific courses to develop their own vocal skills, and to look into topics such as the changing voice for teenagers. But similarly, I've worked with adults a lot more recently this year, and the amount of adults who have little control over their voice because they've been put off with singing, particularly it seems from born in the 70s sort of period. This is music teacher identity of, oh, stand at the back, you sound awful, just mine. So actually just encouraging people to find their way into singing, I think, is where we start.
Great, thank you. Some great tips there. Baz, what would be your top tips?
Just a couple. I would say that thing of normalizing singing, there's so much research that points to the fact that if it's not just something that happens in a protected space, but it's just going on throughout people's lives, that in itself breaks down so many barriers, but can also develop better social bonding, better self-esteem as well. So it's easy to say, isn't it? Oh, we just normalize singing. If only it could be that easy. But the more it feels like that, the more the fear of it will be reduced, I think. The other thing is, I mean, I can still remember very clearly some one-to-one conversations I had with adults, with music teachers when I was younger, that were absolutely key in helping me find my path. And I think the value of the one-to-one conversation at all stages of a young person's development is absolutely huge. It's a big world, and singing is a complex thing. Just being able to kind of just help a young person step back and see what opportunities there are could be really valuable.
Great, thank you. And Ally?
Along the same lines, really, I think we need to look at this, as has already been said, through these two lenses of what can we do to support young people, but also what can we do to support adults. The normalising the environment, I'd written that down too, about the whole community, it being regular, something we all do together. It always strikes me when the football is on the TV, how much you can hear the singing all coming through together. It's something in that environment that is normalised and we all do. And I don't suppose there are too many people standing there going, oh, I was told not to sing at school, because, it's an environmental thing. So for me, the biggest thing is about thinking about the environment, making sure that the environment is open, accepting, creative, engaging, enjoyable, relaxed. With that comes so much, though. Again, these are all easy things to say and difficult things to achieve. I think we have to sometimes pat ourselves on the back for the small wins and accept that it takes a long time to build a safe environment, and the relationships that we build along the way, they're really, really so crucial to that. The second thing, which was said, Michael just said, we have to emulate it to our students. We have to model it. We have to be that person who's going to give the confidence, who's going to know how to nurture. And it's the knowing how, I think, as well, that's really, really important in that. And from my perspective in teacher education, we get a lot of people coming in who aren't very confident. They need to be in a big group that becomes safer and safer as the group gets smaller, for them to be able to stand up and lead things for themselves. And so the third part of that really is have lots of tools, have lots of techniques, skills, strategies, help, support, and people. So, at the heart of this is the fun thing, making it enjoyable, making it something we want to do. And I'm going to come back to all of this a little bit later.
Brilliant, thank you. We've covered some fantastic top tips there. Lots about confidence from teachers, radiating out to students, modelling positive behaviour, normalising singing, techniques, tools and courses to develop. So lots to think about there. So let's dig in a bit more detail to some of these topics. So first of all, starting with Baz, could you speak on how singing can support students with their health and well-being and improve social bonding? I know that you've done a lot of work with Sing Up Foundation and research in this area.
Yes, and of course it's an enormous area, and I won't go over all of the many benefits that singing can bring to ranges of health and well-being conditions. I've furnished Ella, and hopefully she'll be, oh, look at that, brilliant, sharing a couple of links that are from the Sing Up Foundation and also from the Sing for Health Network. That give a sort of a breakdown of the science behind it. For example, the release of endorphins and serotonin, which can help with mood regulation and the sort of feel-good factor, but also the oxytocin, which is the bonding and trust hormone that can be released during singing. Those are hugely powerful things. Singing is a really big word, and I think we need to be careful about overgeneralizing about what it can achieve. It is specific to the environment. The normalization of singing will go a long way. At the Sing Up Foundation, we're really interested in looking beyond what you might call everyday well-being and into more specific issues. We know that mental health is a huge issue for children and young people right now. So what does that look like in terms of singing activity? If it's a kind of, let's sing Oh Happy Day or something like that, is that going to achieve what you want it to do, or could that potentially have a negative effect? Is what the music you're working with potentially triggering in some way if you're dealing, for example, with early life trauma? So we're really sort of going into detail to understand what that looks like. I can, if you don't mind me doing a plug, we did a podcast series last year called Inspiring Voices, where we spoke to individuals who they've just got that special sauce, you know, they can work magic with children in whatever their kind of challenging contexts are. And there's some really brilliant stories there that give an insight into how it works. That could be, you know, Chris, who works in secure units, saying it'll be several weeks before we sing because the voice, that's too exposing for those young people. Or it could be Ben. Some people may have already come across Rap Club and Ben's amazing work in finding a connection with these young people that led to this club, where the outcomes were absolutely extraordinary in terms of the way that they bonded, talked about their lives and their backgrounds, supported each other, developed their voices, singing and rapping, achieved curriculum outcomes. You know, the list went on and on and on. And that's not necessarily because it was rapping, but it was because he found a connection and he found a way to address what those young people were going through in a way that felt comfortable and engaging for them. And that really sort of is the key. And I think with any kind of a health condition, as well as understanding what you're dealing with, understanding some of the science and the practice behind it, is that thing of then thinking, well, actually, what's going to work here? What can I do in a safe way that will help these people, either directly because you know, we might be doing something around songwriting, for example, that can help people address their emotions or some of the challenging aspects of their lives, which needs to happen in a safe environment. Or it could be recognizing that actually singing that particular song with those particular harmonies is going to be really powerful and uplift them and release some of those, you know, feel good hormones and chemicals and that kind of thing. So yeah, connection, I think, is a really key thing.
Thank you. That's great. And staying with you, Baz, what do you think about this issue of fear of failure? You know, we hear a lot of people saying, I can't sing, or I'm embarrassed to sing. And that's from both adults and young people. I know you've done a lot of work with the National Teachers Choir. You're the co-founder of the National Teachers Choir. How do you help teachers to build their singing confidence and overcome that fear of failure?
Yeah, there are a lot of tools out there. that people can access relatively straightforwardly. Sing Up Songbank, for example, Sparkyard from Out of the Ark, Singing Playgrounds from Ex Cathedra, things that actually help with that normalization of singing. How do I get it happening in my school? And how can I find things that don't, that aren't about me standing up and singing to my class, but they might be warm-ups. There might be things you can get the young people to lead. There might be call and response that actually are done through demo tracks. So I think it's that kind of, I spent most of my teenage years terrified of singing solo, and I really do relate to it. I think it's, it's a bit of kind of easing it in. With National Teachers Choir, I mean, it's not an auditioned choir. We welcome anyone who wants to come along. But a lot of that is actually to do with relating it back to the classroom and saying, actually, here's a really fantastic chant that you can teach really easily, or around, or just anything really. We explore all sorts. In terms of the actual performance, because we do tend to get them to perform and they do seem to love it. Actually, that is to do with some conductor skill where the learning is scaffolded. They learn everything in 24 hours and perform it. And it's the way it's built up in little stages, and they get to just before the performance and go, well, I know this. How on earth have I learned all of this from memory? And I think that kind of thing can be enormously empowering. So we're always encouraging teachers, particularly if they're not confident, to get out and get into an environment where they can sing with other people and commit to doing that, because that really, really does help.
Brilliant, thank you. And we were just talking before we started the webinar about how many teachers' choirs there are out there in the country these days. So do check out your local teachers' choir, because it's a great way to kind of enhance your love of singing and build your confidence. I'm going to bring Ally in on this now, because Ally is an expert on performance anxiety and kind of fear of failure when it comes to musical performance. So Ally, could you talk to us a little bit more about performance anxiety and how teachers can help students to overcome it? And what are some practical tools that they should consider, and kind of where can they go for support in terms of performance anxiety?
Sure. First thing to say is that the work that I've done with this, which is actually with the support of the fantastic ISM Trust, has been done with me as an educator and my husband as a psychologist, so bringing the two sides of this together. So our joint experiences are kind of represented in the work that I'm going to talk a little bit about. I think we have to be really clear about music performance anxiety and the term. And Diane Kenny's definition of this is the experience of intense and persistent anxious apprehension related to musical performance. And I think sometimes that is the case. And, we do have this intense and persistent anxious apprehension. But at other times we have performance nerves, or we have other things that are just going on in our lives, and that kind of impacts on how we think and how we feel. And so it's very difficult to kind of make generalizations along these things. But if you look at the performance anxiety in that sense, there are all sorts of things going on. It might be that we have, for example, some physiological symptoms, some sweaty hands, some shallow breathing, some nausea, a dry mouth. Might have some cognitive things. I've got some negative thoughts. I'm just about to walk on stage and I think, oh, this is going to be rubbish. I might doubt my ability. I might have a memory loss. I might just blank the words. For myself, sometimes I have to write down little strategies just to write down the first 4 notes on something. So if I'm doing something from memory, I can actually remember how things start. Other things with the cognitive strategies, you question yourself, you have a dislike of pressure, but that can also lead to the behavioral things, the avoidance, the making mistakes, having a poorer performance, getting short-tempered, gibbering, wittering. And then sometimes these things happen in chains. You've got sweaty hands and then your brain goes, oh, why am I sweaty? Oh, perhaps I'm a bit nervous. Oh, right, I'm a bit nervous. Oh, right, I can't really remember what I'm doing. So they don't really come to individually. Sometimes they come in chains as well. So kind of, I think for teachers, watching out for those things and acknowledging them, so I think much as we talk about normalizing singing, we also have to talk about normalizing anxiety, creating an environment where we flip it over and think, how do I perform optimally? When I was performing really well, what was it that I was doing? What was I feeling? What was I thinking? So we go for this kind of approach orientation potentially. But again, that's very general, you know, for some different people, different things will be needed to work. But basically, we need to create an environment where people want to do something and then they want to engage. And if you flip that over and go, all right, so you want to do it, what do we need to put in place to help you to be able to do what it is that you want to do? And actually, I just talked a little bit just then about nerves. And for some people, you know, they worry when those nerves aren't quite there before they go and do something. So we don't need to look at it that it's always something that's really bad. But if we think about things like previous optimal performance, when was the last time you performed your best? What can you remember in the build up to it? And what can you remember while you were singing or playing? And how did you feel after you stopped? What were you thinking? What were you feeling? How did you behave? All really big questions. I'm asking them in 10 seconds, but they would take a while to kind of, you know, listen to yourself and think about those things. We also have to be able to kind of separate our thoughts. I'm having a thought that says I'm going to forget my words. I'm not actually forgetting my words. I'm just having a thought that tells me. So putting a buffer in can be quite a helpful thing. You know, I'm having a thought that says this. I'm having a thought that says that. So it's separating your thoughts from everything else. We have worked, as I was saying, with the lovely ISM Trust to come up with 2 sets of resources. And I do believe that Ella's got them to hand. One of them, the first one we did was called Performance Anxiety, a practical guide for music teachers. And it literally is like a toolkit based on flowcharts. And you go through and you go, right. So we'll talk about long-term, medium-term and short-term considerations. Because I'm a big believer in there's no point in throwing something to somebody as they're about to go into their exam or their performance, you know, oh, well, if you do get butterflies in your stomach, then try this. You know, it's probably a little bit late by then. You probably need to have put in some kind of long-term things. But we need to think through long-term, medium-term and short-term considerations. We talk in here about some of the psychology of common sense, I suppose you might call it, some things about time management, some things about writing a list so that you don't get halfway to something and go, oh, I left my music behind, which is what I've definitely been guilty of. Have I got a black t-shirt with me? Stop in the motorway services, just have a quick look. If we've got a tick list, you know, some of these things are just really, really practical. It talks about something that's really important in schools, which is around social comparison. And how do we help children deal with social comparison? A lot of these things are not just for singing and for music, but they go much wider than that. And then the last section of it is the kind of the 7 days up to the performance, through the performance and out the other side. So at the end of a performance, you know, I've seen amazing performances and somebody comes off and the first thing they do is burst into tears. And so, you know, they've just done something absolutely brilliant, but the emotional level is really high. What can we do with it? Give them a notepad, get them to write down what they're thinking, screw it up, put it somewhere, come back to it another time. So they've parked it. So there's lots of kind of practical things there. The second resource we put together, we ran lots of courses at the ISM with Ruth and her colleagues. We had lots of teachers came along. What became evident halfway through every single day when we ran these courses was that people go, oh, actually, I'm here for myself as well as my students. So we know that a lot of teachers are interested in the topic and looking for things for themselves. So we put together Play, and it's purposely called something really positive that flips it, a psychological toolkit for optimal music performance, which I'm sure the lovely Ella is just about to put a link up for. And it's really strategies for adults, some of which are similar-ish, but not really. It's kind of a much kind of deeper side of things. Dealing with fear of success can be as devastating as dealing with fear of failure. So if I get that and that goes really well, my life is going to change in whatever way that is. So we have to kind of take into account all of these things. So yeah, I would say flip it over, be playful with things that you do and you find. So find strategies and then they're not set in stone. Play with them. Think about the people that you work with. Help them to own them so that you do things together. But we've got lots of practical resources there to help you with that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ally. There are lots of practical strategies in the resources that Ally was referring to, so do take a look at those and get in touch with the ISM Trust if you'd like to find out more. We also have a webinar on performance anxiety, which we can share in the chat if you'd like to dig in deeper to that topic. So when we're thinking about creating an inclusive singing environment, we also need to consider being gender inclusive. And Michael, I'd like to bring you in here, as I know you've got some slides to share on gender identity and voice, as well as LGBTQIA+ inclusivity in singing. So can I hand over to you, please?
Yes, absolutely. I thought I would begin today just with a kind of back to basics understanding of what it is we're talking about when we hear all of these acronyms and all of these different terms that perhaps we're not familiar with. In my experience working with music teachers, I do a lot of teacher training. Teachers want to help, they want to support their students of all ages, adults, all the way down to kindergartners, but they're often not sure how. They're worried about saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. So the genderbread person is a model. It's not the only model, but it's a model just to help you get to grips with some of the basic ideas. So biological sex is probably the easiest place to start, is where we're thinking about the sex that people are born with, okay? Then sexual orientation is to do with attraction, romantic attraction. Gender identity is within yourself, your own understanding of who you are as a person, and how you identify. And then your gender expression is how you represent that to the world. So that could be through clothing that you're wearing, or it could be through how you manage your voice. It could be through mannerisms, things like that.
Sorry to interrupt, Michael. We can't see all of your screen and it doesn't seem to have gone on to that slide. Do you mind just sharing again?
No, not at all. That's fine. Let me try again.
Thank you.
Apologies.
Bear with us.
How about now?
Yeah, it seems to be slightly cutting off the edge of the screen. It might be easier if you
that's right, that's
just
fine.
go into that view.
Leave it like this, is this okay? Yeah,
Brilliant.
That's fine. I'll zoom in for you. We'll do it from here. No worries. Okay, so this is the model I was just referring to, just as a kind of summative, basis for us to be building from. I personally have a bit of an issue with this model because the way it's presented is that these 4 categories are seen to be on a scale. Okay, it's good that it seems to be on a sliding scale. Things may change for our students, but it does seem to be quite polar opposites. Okay, and that's not always how gender identity, sexual orientation, that's not always how this works. So this is just a very basic model to hopefully separate out those 4 components for you. One thing that a lot of people I've worked with before have not really understood is the term non-binary or gender non-conforming. You might see abbreviated GNC. So someone who's non-binary does identify as male or as female, and the pronouns that they choose could be anything between she, her, they, them, he, him, anything depending on them personally. They may feel they don't identify as a man or as a woman, or somewhere in between, or it could be a completely different sliding scale. Being non-binary is part of the transgender spectrum. So within the transgender spectrum, we have people who may be genderqueer, or maybe transgender, or could be gender non-conforming. They all kind of fit under this umbrella term. Another abbreviation you might come across with students is NB, but pronounced or written ENBY sometimes. I think the key thing to be thinking about with non-binary students in particular, but with any students, is being careful about how you talk about pronouns. I often invite students to share their pronouns with me, and then I will also check who they would like me to use those pronouns with. It might not be safe for them to use those pronouns widely. If I'm introducing them as a soloist at a concert, for example, and they have family members in the audience, it might not be safe for them to, be outed as not having what society perceives should be the correct pronouns. So I always check with them first whether they want it to just be used between me and them on one-to-one conversations, to be used within the group, or to be used kind of publicly, if you like. And be very careful as well with the term chosen pronouns is really difficult. I find they're not chosen pronouns, they're just someone's pronouns. Preferred pronouns you might have heard a lot of as well. What are someone's preferred pronouns? They're not preferred, they're just their pronouns. It's as simple as that. Another issue in terms of this broad idea of labeling is surrounding the word queer. Sometimes referred to as questioning. It's an umbrella term academically for meaning not straight, not aligning with the heteronormative perspective. In English terminology, it used to mean odd, strange, or weird, and it has historically been used as a derogatory term towards gay men. So the kind of the issue with queer, I suppose, is that queer is an identity. Some might feel that they might identify as queer. That might be the label they use for them. Queer is an academic term. And sometimes within the LGBT plus community, it is used as kind of a catch-all phrase instead of LGBT plus. There's obviously some contention with this. Some people will have an issue that, for me personally, I don't associate myself with the word queer. I've only heard that phrase accompanied with the threat of having my head kicked in when I was younger, So for me, it's something that I wouldn't associate with me, but I can appreciate as an academic and as a member of the community that it is used by other people. So it's a slightly unusual one. And I think with all of this, these ideas of labels, they are for the individual to use, not for anyone else to be using. Sometimes it's very powerful to, if I refer to myself as a gay man, when I first did that, that felt, like a massive relief. For some people, it's because they don't want to use terms, but they do because it makes their life easier, because other people can then understand and interact with them a bit better. And that's really down to the individual. Very briefly, this idea of intersectionality and lenses, this is a whole other discussion to have, but thinking about how all of people's lived experience was something I mentioned earlier. So thinking about people's sex or their gender, their physical ability, their education, their social class, their ethnicity, nationality, how all of those different things interact with one another, to see how society perceives a person and how that person perceives themselves. I would encourage you at home to just spend 5 minutes and do a little exercise with yourself like this. Think about, what does it mean? How does your education intersect with your age? How does your social class intersect with your ethnicity? Things like that. What are the hurdles you've come across in life? So this idea of labeling is rife in the music world as well, especially if we're dealing with choral voices. We have soprano, tenor, alto, and bass being used in choirs. The SATB format seems to be very sacred. It seems to be the most prolifically composed for and arranged for. If we're looking at, this is just a brief summary for you so you can see overlap of ranges. If we're referring to mezzo voices and baritone voices, typically mezzo and baritone voices are the average untrained singing voice, okay? Typically, we're thinking high female for soprano, low female for alto, high male for tenor, and low male for bass. But with all of these dictionary definitions, gender is attributed explicitly to that label. So this can cause some discomfort for students if you have someone who is non-binary or transgender perhaps, and they are an alto, let's say, and you are referring to your altos as, okay, ladies, let's go from the top, or something like that, yeah? Okay, boys, can I just have you go from letter G, There's lots of gender terminology stuck within this, and I think we need to try and pull it apart a little bit. In terms of gender inclusive language, things that we can be using instead of men, women, boys, girls, try some gender neutral terms with your group. Singers, can we go from this rehearsal mark? Okay, musicians, vocalists, how are we feeling today? Or folks, the gender neutral term is great. Similarly, with younger students, it's quite common these days to use the word grown-ups instead of mummies or daddies or parents. You know, students might not have parents. They might be adopted, they might be living with grandma, who knows? So just think about how we can change our language in our classrooms, in our choirs, just to enable that safer space. In terms of referring to voice parts, I tend to go with upper, sopranos and altos, and lower voices. Outer and inner is quite useful, often because outer is tune and bass line, and then inner is just the harmony parts. That's quite a common combination I find myself using in rehearsals anyway. And then I use high and low voices for soprano, tenor, and alto bass. And this is quite common as well, because if you're doing two-part stuff within a four-part context, often the tune is in the higher voices and the harmony or the bass line in the lower voices there. Thinking about repertoire as well, for example, old folk song, Row Boys Row. Row boys row, up the rivers go, long pull, strong pull, row kids row. I change at the end to row kids row all the time now. I use kids instead of boys. The second verse allegedly uses girls, and I had a girl say to me once in a class, well, why are the girls second? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, oh, it's the second. And she was, I don't know, 7 at the time. And a couple of girls in the class all chipped in and said, it's the same way at school. We're always second. The girls are always second, but in this context or that context. So just by changing it to kids, there's no difference at all. It's not changing or erasing any of the historical discrimination from that song, but it is much more inclusive. So in terms of just top tips for me in this aspect, really, actions speak louder than words, always. This idea of challenging versus calling out minority minimizing behaviors. Challenging is through questioning. Why did you feel that? Can you just explain that to me? Perhaps I'm misunderstanding your viewpoint. Calling out, that is not okay. You will not use that language in my classroom. There's a difference. Calling out is statements, not questions. Explicit visibility, having inclusive curriculum, inclusive displays, things like that. Involve your ensembles in the discussions as well. Talk to those students. Normalize pronoun usage. You can add them to your email signature, add them to screen names if you're doing online teaching at all, and then challenge any normalized homophobic or gender discriminative language. That's so gay, he sings like a girl, boys are better than girls, things like that. And then for me, my guiding principles, first and foremost, do no harm. When you know better, do better. Reach out to minority groups to include them, but do not burden them to do the work for you. This is really, really important. When I say minority groups, I mean the deaf and hard of hearing community. I mean ethnic minorities. I mean women, trying to talk about getting them involved with female composers being used in concerts and things. Don't burden minority people to try and do the work for you. Involve them in the discussion, but do your own research. As I said, challenge through questions and call out through statements, and apologize when you get it wrong, especially to children. There is nothing more powerful than going, hey, I was misinformed. I've done some research and I've learned better. I misspoke. I'm really sorry. There is nothing more powerful than that. And for me, I'll just leave you with this quote, Maya Angelou. People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And we can start doing this in our classrooms and in our choirs by ensuring we've got as open a rehearsal space as possible.
Thank you so much, Michael. There was some really useful tips and advice in there, and that was a really helpful overview as well, so thank you. Just kind of leading on from that, do you have any guidance on suitable and inclusive uniform policies for choral performances, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, I always just go with concert blacks, and that's the simple description they get. What are we wearing? Concert blacks. Black from head to toe. And they can wear any combination that they like, whether that is, shirts or a blouse, skirts and tights, or a dress or trousers, smart shoes. And it's up to students what combination they wear there. I think it's really important for us, especially with transgender students or non-binary students, we need to get a balance between pedagogical and pastoral needs. So for example, if you had a student who came to you as female and was situated within your alto section of an SA2B choir, and then at some point of the year they came out to you, said that they were wanting to socially transition, go by a different name, be seen as a boy, it might not be pedagogically appropriate for them to start singing with the tenors because their voice is not in the correct range. But pastorally, there is absolutely nothing wrong with, if you've got your choir laid out, sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses, that they can be stood on the fringe next to the tenors, so that they are still stood with the boys, as it were, with a gender-inclusive uniform policy, wearing a shirt and trousers, however they choose to wear. So we can bridge that gap and find out what's appropriate at that time for the student, balancing pastoral and pedagogical.
Okay, thank you. And this is open to everyone. Does anyone have any thoughts about appropriate audition processes for choirs to ensure that students feel comfortable, included and appreciated? Maybe start with you, Ally, on that one.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure Baz is going to have a lot to say on this one too. I suppose from a kind of the psychological perspective, you just want to make people feel comfortable, feel that they have been able to represent themselves in a way that they are pleased with. So I think you need to look at that from the perspective of the teacher getting the young person, or maybe a young adult, to go into the audition, but also from the side of the people running the audition, if you like. And I think there's probably work to be done there on both sides. Some of the things you hear about higher level auditions and things that people can't cope with is they get no feedback. They just get a thank you and a blank face. And you want to walk into somewhere and feel that you're getting some kind of feedback, I think. So I think that's really important, but that culture is very, very slow to change. One of the biggest things about stress is not knowing what something is going to look like and going into something that's unknown. From an audition perspective, making sure that you've controlled all the things that you can control, that you've showed them pictures of what it might look like inside. You may have shown them a picture of the person who's going to be sitting behind the table. If possible, you've taken them into the space. They may have had the opportunity to be able to go and sing in there. So kind of, taking away some of the things that if your mind doesn't know what it's going to be, then, there's that can also give you the stress and the fear. So trying to make that kind of clear and obvious to them as possible, so that they've had an opportunity to experience it for themselves. I think that's the one I'd throw in first. Thank you.
And Baz, anything to add in terms of audition processes?
Yeah, I like Nick's comment about I just don't audition. I think there is a thing about, like, consider, do you need to audition? And if you do, what's in it? And does it need to be in it? For sight reading, for example, to what degree do you need it? I think there's certainly a thing about being clear about what you're actually looking for from your singers, both for your own purposes, but also to share with them as well. You could do something like a Diamond 9 process, where you just come up with, what does our ideal singer look like, and prioritize that, and then be clear about that's what you're looking for. That can help. I think talking about people who have auditioned, or who you've auditioned in the past, successfully or otherwise, finding out about their experience. Anywhere where you think that there might be barriers that you want to overcome, be overt in showing that actually you are not looking to exclude those people. You want to welcome them. And was there one more thing? No, I think that was probably everything. Yes. Great,
thank you. Okay, well, we've covered a lot already, and we're now going to tackle some of the questions that we've received from you, our audience. So thank you very much to those of you who sent questions in advance, and we've also had some questions in the Q&A function. We'll try and get them through as many as possible in the remaining time. So first of all, and we've kind of touched on this quite a lot already, but what are some strategies to create an environment where students will be excited to sing? And I think this is slightly linked to one of the comments we had in the chat about kind of how can we embrace students' own repertoire choices, you know, songs that they're keen to sing, but are also appropriate for them and kind of fit in with the curriculum and the lesson plans. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe start with you, Baz.
Yes, in fact, I answered something in the chat that linked to that, which I think actually there is something there about upping the skill and the confidence about the leader to be able to present. You know, we talk about this a lot actually in mental health and well-being, that sometimes it's not about finding a song that's got exactly appropriate lyrics. It's actually it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it in a way. It's a great an effective leader should be able to take a whole range of songs and make them really engaging to learn, and then that starts to be kind of self-fulfilling because people start to see how much people are enjoying the singing, and in some cases that the result is really good as well.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that? Ally?
I would say sometimes the term singing itself can be the off-putting bit. So sometimes we might want to think about vocalizing or looking at things in different ways. If the way to get them in is through a particular genre of music where there isn't melodic change to start with, then, you know, find what it is that you can excite children with. Sometimes that comes through things like, you know, looking at Beat Goes On and their work, it comes through the physical things first rather than through the voice first, but the voice becomes part of it. There was an absolutely brilliant thing that the BBC did a few years ago where they came into one of our local high schools, which the kids were very much, "I don't sing," but they made a video with them that was put up, and they, I think, used Jess Glynne's song and kind of mashed them together. And the children said, "Oh yeah, I'm really up for this. You know, it's like drama, isn't it? You know, but we're not going to sing." And the brilliant, beautiful thing about the thing when it came together is that they were all just absolutely singing their hearts out, because it wasn't about singing; it was all of the other stuff too. So for me, I think you have to meet children, no matter what you're teaching them. You know, you have to meet them where they are, and then find a way to bring in what you want. And I go back to my football example that culture and environment are so crucial to that. So think about where you're singing, what you're singing for, and all of those things.
Absolutely. And I think you've kind of answered Nick's question in the Q&A about how we can remove the barriers to get children and young people starting to sing, getting them through the door to singing sessions. Anything to add on that, kind of how to kick off singing in a school environment? Michael, is there anything you want to add?
I think for me, it comes from us emulating and modeling what good singing is and what good, you know, how much do we enjoy singing. I always teach pedagogically sound repertoire, but I cannot teach something I just don't like. I have zero poker face, and if I'm teaching a song that I just think is a bit of a dirge, my face will show it, and my body language will show it, and the kids will receive that. So I always pick not stuff that is my favorite, stuff that is useful and pedagogically sound, but stuff that I am passionate about, you know, songs, cultures I want to expose as children to. And I think in a lot of the choir conducting training I've done as well, I see time and time again, in the nicest possible way, the problem is the teacher often. I know it's easier said than done for us to be really confident choral conductors and singers, and it comes from a lifetime of experience and, you know, lots and lots of training. But very often students will engage with a student, with a teacher who is charismatic and, you know, shows their passion for the subject, whether or not that teacher is necessarily the most skilled person on the planet. And so I think it comes from our persona as a director or a conductor or a singer or a leader, whatever your context is. That's really important, and I think that will just radiate out to your students, and then they will sing. If you want to sing, they will want to sing for you, and I think that's really key.
Thank you.
Can I just add something about students' own sort of leadership? I think one of the most effective ways of achieving this that I've ever seen was all the stuff around singing playgrounds. Ex Cathedra have been one of the great components proponents of that, but there are others. This idea that it doesn't always have to be taught by adults. If you can set up an environment where young people are sharing their own songs and singing games, then we go back to kind of the culture, and from that culture can happen really extraordinary things.
Thank you, Baz. Ally.
Yeah, I wanted to come on this one as well because I think it's absolutely crucial. I'll tell you a little story about a school that I went into quite a few years ago that prided itself on its music department and how inclusive it was. And there was a child that I was talking to in a Year 9 lesson, and I said, "Oh, you're going to do GCSE music next year." And she looked at me absolutely horrified and went, "No, I'm rubbish at music." And yet she just sung me a song. She was a singer-songwriter. But basically, she didn't feel that her music was validated within that school environment. So, we have to really have our ear to the ground as to how our students are feeling about themselves as musicians and whether they'll bring themselves to what we're offering. And if we don't validate those experiences, we're not going to get them to sing in our context. They may actually be writing really beautiful lyrical songs elsewhere, but then they feel that they're not valued. And sometimes that's just a perception. Actually, it's not always the case. I don't want to waggle my pen and put it back down. But that they are valued. It's just that sometimes we need to be more explicit about it. I suppose the other thing to bring into that is, worked in a school before which didn't seem to have a great singing culture until we had a musical, at which point we had them queuing up at the door. So, finding lots of things. If something doesn't work, try something else. Yeah.
Great advice. Thank you. Do you have any advice for finding your own voice? And I guess this is to do with for teachers as well as students, rather than copying others' singing styles. Can I give that one to you, Baz?
Can you give it to me? Solo singing stuff I'm not so expert on, but I think exploration is a really great thing, and I think that's particularly something for singing teachers. If that can be with something that a young person is able to engage with, maybe it's on offer from Music Hub or something, but a good vocal teacher will be able to respond to intricacies of the voice and help them to explore different styles.
Any other thoughts on that? No.
Slightly left of centre, but the kind of fear of failure thing and normalising things and having a buffer for ourselves and giving room for exploration. I think what Baz is saying is the teacher is actually really crucial in that, setting up, exploratory, playful way of teaching so that people feel they can explore their voices. We live in a culture where things are right or wrong. We do a test, it's right or wrong. We do an exam, and even in music where, you might have bands of a pass, a merit and a distinction. They're all labels, but there is quite a big buffer of pass, if you like, in there. So giving ourselves that kind of buffer of what's acceptable, and then taking everything from there and building on that. I think the psychological thing about finding your voice is quite an interesting area we can't really do today, but yeah, lots in there too.
Yeah, I agree with Ally. I would just follow up and say that with a lot of my singing students, I always insist on referring to the voice as a biological instrument. You're going to have a phlegmy day, you're going to have a cold and be stuffed up, you're going to have a dry throat. You don't have that with other instruments. If you're playing a sax solo and it doesn't quite go right, you have that little buffer to go, oh, I chipped my reed, or there's not enough rosin on my bow. If someone says they don't like your vocal performance, what they're saying implicitly is they don't like you. They don't like what you are putting out into the world. And I think there is a massive psychological barrier there when we sort of can partition the fact that our singing voice is a part of us, but is a separate thing that just needs a bit of TLC from time to time. But that takes a long time to allow a student to be comfortable to think of it in that way.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've just got time for one more question. I know we've had a lot of quite specific questions in the Q&A, and perhaps we can share those with our panelists afterwards and get back to you on an individual basis. But final question that was submitted in advance. What are your thoughts on how trauma history can pose a barrier to singing, and how can we help students who've had negative past experiences to sing? Ally, any thoughts on that?
Gosh, what a big question at 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yes, yes, sorry.
I think that is such a big question, and it very much depends on the individual, what you know about them, your relationship with them, what you're talking about when you talk about trauma. And, you know, there's lots of things around at the moment about trauma-informed practice and, you know, music for well-being. I'm sure Baz has got some links and things that he's talked about this afternoon that relate into that. So I think it's too big a question to be able to offer something general on. I think it is about that strong relationship, not being scared though as the adult to go somewhere else for support, because, you know, sometimes we need that too. And we've got a lot of professionals. We have, you know, music therapists, we have lots of HCPC registered people in lots of other ways that can also help depending on what the situation is, but recognizing that music can open something up. And it can make you cry, and it can make the next person laugh, you know. So yeah, I think it's very much about knowing the person and the situation.
Yeah, okay. Anyone want to add anything to that? Okay, thank you. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you very much to Ally, Michael and to Baz for that extremely insightful session on personal and psychological barriers to singing. I hope you found today's session informative and useful, and if you do have any further questions or feedback, please do email us on inquiries@ismtrust.org, and please do also fill in our post-webinar survey, which you will find in the chat, and it will also be emailed out to you afterwards. Your feedback is really appreciated. It helps us to improve our services and to offer more free professional development to music educators and musicians. The webinar recording will be sent to you by email afterwards, and it will be available to watch back on the ISM website. So do feel free to watch back and share with your friends and colleagues. We will also send you some useful links that have been shared in the chat. And just to say that this was our final event in the Breaking the Singing Barrier series. And if you'd like to watch back the other webinars in the series, that includes our SEND Barriers to Singing webinar, cultural barriers to singing, and differing barriers between primary and secondary singing, which can all now be found on the ISM website. You can also find there our 20 short videos which explore solutions and tools to create a safe space for singing. There's some great tips in there, and they're all very quick to watch. So if you've got sort of 5 minutes in your lunch break, do have a look at those videos. And our next event is an ISM Members Fund webinar on writing a will on the 19th of June. So do join us if that is of interest to you. And finally, can I just thank you again for watching, and we hope to see you at another ISM event soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.